Hi, and welcome to Lightcast webinars. It's great to have you with us today. Thank you for joining us. I'm excited to be discussing micro credentialing and a few other things around data. We have with us today Richard Hewitt, who is the Director for HE UK for Lightcast. And we have a special guest as well, who Richard will be introducing to you in a moment. We will be having a follow-up email sent out afterwards where the recording and the slides will be sent to you. So please keep your eyes open for that. And if you have any questions during the course of the webinar, please put them in the questions box on your control panel. And we will endeavour to get back to those at the end of the presentation or whenever Richard sees them. So without any further ado, thank you, Richard. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Debbie, and hello, everyone. And yeah, as Debbie said, I'm really delighted to be joined by my good friend, Professor Rupert Ward, Professor of Learning Innovation at the University of Huddersfield, and someone who has put in a lot of thought to the area of micro-credentialing over the years, and is something of a leading light in the area, in the field. And so hopefully what we can do today is shine a light on how there is a relationship between what Lightcast does in terms of data and labour market data and skills data, and the kind of work that Rupert has been leading on. So the granular articulation skills which are relevant to employers is a key feature of how micro-credentials can support graduates transition into and within the workforce. And so Rupert and I today are going to be discussing how skills profiling and skills data were used in a study led by Rupert at the University of Huddersfield and recently published by the UK's Quality Assurance Agency of Higher Education here in the UK. And the British universities involved in the study created skills profiles of their learners and their courses. They connected those profiles to Lightcast job postings data to better understand how what is sought by employers was being reflected and articulated by what is taught by higher education providers. Now, as many of you are aware, Rupert has been immersed in this world of micro-credentialing for a long time, but also being a university professor, he also has some really interesting insights into how these visions of micro-credentialing might actually be realized within a higher education institution. And I think this study is an important step towards that. So hello, Rupert, and welcome.
Nice to be here. Thank you, Richard.
But before we get cracking with looking into the study, allow me first to introduce Lightcast, because we do have a number of people who haven't attended one of our webinars joining us today and maybe new to who we are. So Lightcast, or MC Burning Glass as we were until a few months ago, is a global leader in labour market analytics. Our data and analytics is used by educators, not only educators, but seeing as this is what we're talking about today, to do things like optimize course portfolios, connect students to courses and careers, and also to communicate outcomes and impact. And by looking at the world through the lens of labour market data, not only can we make those connections between courses and outcomes, we can also begin to formulate new possibilities in the labour market, hence meeting our mission. And the way that we do this is to bring together a whole range of labour market insight, including traditional labour market data, the kind that you get from government reports. We have comprehensive multi-source online job postings data, so the kind of online job advertisements from government, company and jobs boards websites, and also people analytics, which is the data that we can glean through professional profiles online. And to make all of this consumable and actionable, we present this data through a range of taxonomies and classifications, from official standards to Lightcast's own dynamic taxonomies, which reflect the changing world of work. Now, how is labour market data applied in higher education at the moment? The universities we work with, a huge focus is on employability, so thinking about how courses align to the labour market in terms of the planning of the entire portfolio from a strategic perspective, to courses which are already running and thinking, well, what is it that the outcome is expected from this program, and how can we best align what we're doing to what employers say they're looking for. So that kind of course design element. The messaging of that to students, but also to employers. So actually communicating, so you've made decisions about what you're teaching and how you're teaching it, but communicating about how what you're doing aligns to the world of work. Thinking about awards which are more closely linked to employment, such as apprenticeships, but also those wraparound experiences like placements, and using data to understand where to engage with employers, and also enabling you to engage with employers as well. See our data being used by lots of institutions for academic research. It's incredibly rich. It's a source of data that's continually updating, so it allows for a lot of new novel research approaches. We see our data being used to help connect external stakeholders and give them a common language through which to communicate. So thinking about external maybe an external economic development agency talking about things in terms of industries, and of course as educators talking about things in terms of courses. Industries employ lots of different types of people from all sorts of different types of jobs. So how do you go from an industry to a course, and how do you make those data connections? And our data is used to facilitate that and provide that common language. And of course, objectivity. All universities talk to employers. They have lots of qualitative insights from the world of work. What the data allows you to do is bring an element of objectivity to that, to enable you to validate what is coming through from those insights. So those are the principal ways that we see our data being used in universities. We're going to see a slightly different approach to that today. So let's first get to grips with the problem that micro-credentialing and HE might be able to solve. And if we look in the last year, nearly 80% of UK job postings didn't even cite an education requirement. A question that often comes through from universities is, well, let's look at those jobs where people need to have a degree. And many of that 80% of jobs are highly skilled jobs. They're graduate type professions, but the employers are not saying you need to have a degree. And even those that do state a degree is desirable, it might be something along the lines of a good degree in a related field or equivalent work experience of or qualifications, and they leave it at that, which isn't very helpful when we think about how to prepare students for the world of work. So what do employers ask for when they advertise vacancies? And what they do ask for are skills. And even in countries like Germany, where education levels are typically cited in job postings, skills requirements are also clearly set out alongside those. Now, not only is there a trend towards the skills described in job postings? Not only that, there is also a trend towards the skills described in job postings becoming richer. So here we can see a comparison of skills data from 2016 with 2022 for green skills required in engineering jobs. So two comparable samples. And you can see quite clearly the increase in density on the right-hand side in the 2022 sample. In the data, it's also clear to see that skills requirements are changing quickly, even within specific sectors and specific roles. And certainly, if you're interested in knowing more about that, we have published a research report, Skilled Beyond Degree, which may be interesting, and I'll make sure that when we follow up this webinar with an email, we'll include a link towards that. But does all of this mean employers don't value degrees? Because that is something that we hear sometimes, particularly in the policy space. I don't think so at all. But does the degree award differentiate students sufficiently to be useful in a hiring process? Does a degree certificate tell employers anything about a candidate's readiness to start work in a particular position? Even a transcript is limited to module titles. And how, if you think about, you know, modules that you may have taken in the past, how well did they describe what you actually developed in skills terms in that program that you could then put into practice in the workplace? And this is potentially where micro-credentials fit in within an HE context. And that's because micro-credentials have been suggested as a way to surface and verify those discrete skills, competencies, attributes that degrees, of course, do in fact develop, but they don't say so anywhere. And it's up to individuals to kind of try and surface that maybe in a face-to-face interview or a letter of application or something like that. But there is no systematic way in which that happens, and perhaps this is where micro-credentials come in. So just going back to skills, because in the end this is what we're talking about. We talk about skills and skills data and how Lightcast deals with skills. So we use a data-driven 3-level skills taxonomy. However, there are lots of lenses through which we can interpret skills, and I think Rupert will be touching on that in terms of 21st century skills. But our base library is really very granular. So there are about 32,000 terms. It's dynamic, so it's updated, and it's driven, what's in the library is driven by what we see employers using, the language that they use. And that granularity means insights can be reinterpreted according to other frameworks. The key thing here, though, is that this is a data language. It's a machine readable language. Each skills term has a code that goes with it, and that can connect the language of work with the language of education, or at least that is the concept. And we've written about how this meeting of employer demanded skills, so what's sought and what's delivered in HE institutions, what's taught in an ebook, skills required, and I'll send a link across for that too later. You can see it on the slide. But this is also key, I think, to Rupert's paper, because what that has is an underpinning of a skills analysis. But Rupert, before we get into that skills profiling work that you did, what was it that you were fundamentally trying to address in the paper that you led for the QAA here?
I think let's just start with a couple of your earlier slides here. You know, so I think the point you were making earlier about the percentage of job postings that don't mention a qualification. Okay, well that could be for different reasons. It could be because they don't see a value in qualifications. It could also be because they're more focused on the specific skills rather than the qualification. Okay, so it's not necessarily, as you were saying now, it's not necessarily that qualifications are becoming redundant. It's just that they're a particular type of signal, a signal to an employer, and there are different ways to signal. So the challenge really that's facing, well, there's a few challenges facing society. So one off this slide is that you've got underemployment. You've got people that are qualified with degrees and higher degrees that aren't being employed in jobs that require that level of skill. Okay, and that has increased in recent years, and that's a problem because it will affect the fabric of society. People will become disillusioned, disgruntled, demotivated. Productivity will go down. You'll get more unrest in society where people are underemployed. You also, on the other flip side of that, you have people with talents and capabilities who may not have traditionally got a degree qualification. And if they are not able to signal their skills and capabilities, their talents to employers, they will also be underemployed or potentially unemployed when there are huge skills gaps in the economy. So from an economic sort of and governance and societal perspective, there's always, well, certainly in the last 30 years in the UK, there's always been a skills gap. There's been a gap between what we need and what we are able to match to the marketplace. Some of that is an educational deficit in terms of not skilling people up in the correct way or not having people going through the system. But a lot of it is a signal issue, right? So fundamentally, the point I was trying to get at within the report and where the work is going in general is, and we can maybe skip forward to the first slide after your one, that there's a capability competency chasm, and this has always existed. So what does this mean? What it means is, when you are in an educational environment, you are predominantly taught capabilities. You learn capabilities. So it's a bit like learning to pass your driving test. Right? What employers are seeking is competency. So learning that those capabilities being applied to context. So it's not about passing your driving test. It's about being able to show that you can do a 3-point turn on a busy road, or you can drive in icy conditions, that you can drive on the wrong side of the road safely. That it's taking what you've learned, and it's being able to apply it in a useful way for employers, right? So that's so fundamentally, we've got, traditionally, education is there to provide a rounded individual, and there's often a lot of pushback within educational circles about we're not a training provider, right? And yet there's also then pushback on the employer's side saying, well, look, we really don't understand what these graduates are coming out with, and I can't differentiate two graduates from different universities, or I can't differentiate two graduates from the same course. And the amount of signal that's coming to them, right? If you think about what the signal is in a usual qualification, it's when you did it, who you are, things like that. It might be, if you've got a transcript, a set of module course marks, but it doesn't really tell you what people are skilled in, right?
Yeah, it risks degrees becoming a commodity almost. Yeah,
or a brand. It's something that you can signal that you have achieved something, and it's also, I think, traditionally, if you look back 30 or 40 years, this wasn't necessarily an issue because there was a much smaller percentage of people doing university degrees, and so the signal was clear. It didn't really matter how detailed that signal was. Whereas if you've got more people acquiring that degree, you need some way to be able to signal within that community. within those graduates, you know, be able to signal what those graduates, how they're different. You know, the choice previously was, oh, you've got a degree, we'll employ you, or you've got a postgraduate degree, we'll employ you, because other people haven't. Whereas now, if a lot of people have got it, how do you know which ones to employ? And actually, that's not even the right way to go, because even if you did, you know, even if you did it for that reason, that's not why you want to be doing it. What you really want to be doing is optimizing performance within society. So from an economic perspective, or from a organizational perspective, you want the most talented, best fitted applicant to be selected for your roles to optimize the performance of your organization or your economy, you know, and for that you need more accurate information on people's ability to perform and the competencies that they have or they're capable of developing.
Yeah, because I suppose one of the differentiators that may still be commonly applied is, although I'm sure there's plenty of HR departments who are trying to find ways not to do this, but you know, is the prestige of the institution. You know, is it a high tariff institution? I think is the correct parlance. And the trouble is, then it's, well, then the institution name is just a proxy for A-level results, which isn't particularly helpful, because, well, you've got A-level results. Why go back to look at A-levels? What has actually been developed in the meantime? And if the answer from the employers is, well, that doesn't matter, surely that's problematic.
Yes, exactly. And the issue alongside this, which is indicative of the problem really, is that employers are moving away from qualifications as, you know, going back to your earlier slide, they're moving away from qualifications as the identifier to make selection criteria on. It might be, it's still a value, you know, it's still a value to go through and complete a university degree, but its role as a signal within society is diminishing. And what's replacing it is other evidence or sub-degree granular evidence that's able to signal better. So to give you an example, PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, in terms of their selection process, about 7 years ago, they got rid of the entry tariffs for university as a selection criteria, okay, because they said it didn't correlate with with who was the best for the job. And they've recently got rid of the requirement to have a 2-1 or a first in a degree. Why? Because clearly as an employer, they are deciding that that selection criteria is not a robust way for them to identify the most talented people. Right? And so there's this big shift to what are more credible, rigorous ways of identifying and signaling that.
And it's interesting because I was talking with the university not too long ago, and discussing along these lines, and their default move was, well, we need to look at degree naming conventions, because previously that, you know, degree names were kind of looking at, well, what are the other degrees which are recruiting well, we can see from UCAS data or HESA data, and maybe we need to make sure we've got a degree with that same name as well at our institution, and then you know, and so there's a lot of that happening, and so it was applying that approach to responding to the labour market, saying, well, now we need to respond to the labour market because that's where a lot of focus is, you know, high value courses, etc., etc. And so maybe what we need to do is make our degree names more defined in terms of how they serve the labour market. But you think what you study, you know, the plethora of skills in every single module that you take across an entire degree, of course, that that can't achieve that. So how can micro credentials perhaps fill that gap?
Yeah, well, we can come on to that. I was just going to on to that point though, because I think it's a useful thing just to explore a little further. Talking about capability and competency, if you think about it, in university degrees traditionally, it will be a capability focused sort of set of definitions, right? Because they're there to identify and measure the outcomes of learning outcomes, right? Okay, and those identify the capabilities that have been developed. Okay, they often use placements or work-based learning or things like that to show the competency development. Okay, so I think one of the natural shifts that may well occur within universities going forward is a shift towards more competency-based learning terms and approaches within universities. So so talking to that point, that it's the naming of the modules or the degrees will move, maybe not the degrees, because I think the degrees, a lot of the traditional titles of degrees have significant longevity because they're like high level abstract catch-all titles for the thing, so something like mechanical engineering, for example, or architecture. People have an understanding of what that is, but within there, at say module level, they may well move more towards competency groupings rather than traditional capability groupings. Right. So, for example, you'd move from terms like electronics and electrical principles to electric battery production, something like that. You'd move from something that would be the taught theory elements, which you'll still have in there, to something that will be, how is this going to be useful on graduation? Yeah. Mm-hmm. But those terms, those things that they're then going to move to, would still need to remain sufficiently, have a sufficient longevity to make them work over the space of decade or two. So yep. so I think that's where that's going to shift. But to answer your other question about the micro credentialing, let's shift on to the next slide, shall we? And we'll start talking about how this then works. So as you can see, the environment's changing. The environment's changing in terms of what the market wants. Okay, and that obviously then filters into how universities are seeking to provide education. But there's also at the same time not just the signaling problem, the capability competency chasm. There's not just that. There's also an acceleration in the speed at which skills requirements change. Right. So you're talking to your other slide about the examples with green energy, where you've got different things changing over a relatively short time period, and certainly shorter than a university validation period. You usually taught 5 years for a university degree, right? So as the environment in which graduates are going to go into is changing, and also with changes in how governments are looking at addressing skills gaps and reskilling the economy, there's big drivers there that are leading to this. So I'll just touch on them briefly because I think it's worth contextualizing it here now. So if you take the UK as an example, they're proposing introducing a lifelong loan entitlement in 2025. And what that will do is it will mean that you're funded for 4 years worth of study, the equivalent thereof, but that you could do that in small amounts. So in micro credentials, right? Okay, or at least in module amounts, right? Yeah. So the government is saying, well, look, okay, you don't have to do a full degree at one institution. You can do bits, right? And you can do it over a long period of time. You don't have to do it at one time. So there's some quite refreshing bits to this, which are, removing a time-constrained way of doing education, which is utterly ridiculous in the modern society, but it's what we're used to, right? And also giving people choice and flexibility to add bits together, right? Now, there's a lot of implications to that in terms of governance, funding, unintended consequences in terms of barriers to learning, and you know, so if you went and did study at your local college, and then you want to go and do some more study at a high tariff university, or you know, or transfer to another part of the UK, for example, there's some real challenges there in how, in practice, the system will allow you to move seamlessly and reduce barriers rather than increase them. But it's clear that that's the direction of travel. The direction of travel is more sub-degree offerings within universities and more integration between non-formal learning, informal learning, and formal learning, and with that, greater links, for example, with commercial organizations. Okay, so for example, one of the things that one of the examples that predated this and is actually covered in the report was LinkedIn Learning. Being able to go and learn through LinkedIn Learning and then feed that into an application for a university degree, so that you had already demonstrated some learning before you came to the institution. And that sort of flexible approach of being able to do bits of learning and develop skills on a more needs-based and a convenient time to yourself, and all of these things, that's where things are going, right? So for this work, it's really, okay, well, look, okay, if that's where things are going, how do we do it? How do we do it within an educational system? And what does that mean? So that was a starting point for this. So Sue Rees had developed a model as part of some previous work for the QAA, where she'd identified a set of different ways in which micro-credentials could link into higher education qualifications. Okay, so the first one is you could just do a set of micro-credentials in parallel to your studies. Second one is that you could use it as an entry criteria. So instead of doing traditional level 3 qualifications before entry into UK universities or higher education institutions, you could do some micro credentials and they could be recognized as equivalent. So you could do, for example, some Google certificates or some LinkedIn Learning or some Coursera courses or whatever, and then you can say, well, look, that actually, yes, you've shown that you're able to come onto our courses. So that's the second one. B. Third one is that you could recognize what they've already done and therefore reduce the amount that you're asking them to do, so accrediting prior learning, and that could be done at undergraduate or postgraduate level. So for LinkedIn Learning, ourselves and Northumbria, for example, have already got systems in place for LinkedIn Learning at postgraduate level. But you could build it into undergraduates. How would that work? And then the last two are about how do you embed micro credentials within qualifications. So one way to do it is to use it as a scaffold alongside traditional modules and courses, and use it almost to augment and to support and enrich the content in there. And so that's a non-credit based version where you're not actually recognizing it for credit, you're just building it in as part of the diet that you're consuming, so to speak. And the final one there is, how do you actually use micro credentials to replace parts of the learning within a degree and recognize it within a credit based system? So those are the different models, and they're a useful set of models to then explore, and that's what we did within the QA report. So okay, let's look at this for a set of universities across the UK, and we use computer science degrees and degrees within a computer science department as the example, just to check across a set so we could compare different courses at different institutions. But the actual approach is something that can be used anywhere in the world for any course, because it's built on learning outcomes, and all university and higher education qualification, all educational qualifications measure capabilities, they measure learning outcomes.
So what did you do with the learning outcomes? You took them from the documentation, then what's the next step?
Yeah, okay. So what you're trying to do, okay, so if we're trying to go with these models, what we're trying to do is we're trying to work out what are the building blocks, what's the level of granularity that enables you to make sense of things in education and things in employment. So capabilities and competencies, right? And the way that we approach doing that is to say, okay, well, look, there's commonality across there. You're developing a set of skills, right? So the common thing between these two is skills. And in particular, that we can use a small number of 21st century skills categories that represent the entirety of learning and the entirety of skills required in job roles. And this is the list we came up with. Now, you could tweak this slightly. So one of the things we might do in future iterations, for example, is T10D there and T11D under the transferable skills, leadership and management. That really realistically can be one area. Okay, and we may rebrand that as something that represents both those terms. Why? Because the way it's written within courses, it could be one, it could be the other, and it really at this level, in terms of degree qualifications, it's not critical that it's one or the other, right? So there's, this is, I think, a point to emphasize is this is a workable solution that needs to be explored in different contexts. So we're going to be exploring it in the US in the new year, for example, and it's something that will evolve over time. So it's not a final fix, perfect solution, but there's enough in here to show that it will work and to show how it will work. Okay, so what do? We said, okay, well, look, you are doing a degree qualification. Your degree qualification has certain subjects that are specific to that qualification. So in computer science, it would be things like programming languages. It would be things like understanding algorithms, how a database is structured, right? And you would take those and you'd say, okay, well, look, those map across to specific skills, subject-based skills. So theory, so that would be things like how a database is structured, okay? Programming languages, that would be process and production. That would be actually how you would go about programming. Technical writing, when you're doing reports on how you've produced an app or a website, okay? Understanding stakeholder needs and other business requirements, etc., etc. So you can split a course down based on the subject specific skills that you're developing, right? So you can come up with a profile for that. So what we did is we said, okay, well, look, if you're looking at this from a subject specific context, what's the distribution of these 21st century skills categories in terms of that subject? How much theory are you doing? How much process and production are you doing? How much self-reflection are you doing, etc., etc.? And you can get a skills profile then for that, and separately and alongside it, there's a lot of different transferable skills that you're developing in a course. So can we look at that same content through that lens and do another skills profile for that? Okay, right. So how do we then do it? Well, it's really straightforward. What you do is you look at, you do a calculation to calculate how many hours are assigned to an individual learning outcome within the qualification. Okay, right. And the way you do that is you look at the amount of taught hours for a module that has a set of learning outcomes, the amount of assessments that are done within that module, and how many learning outcomes are used in each of those assessments. Okay, and from that you can work out a number of hours per learning outcome.
Right.
And then for the subject specific areas, you would code that learning outcome against one of those 6 subject based areas. And for the transferable, what you would do is you would split that number of hours between all relevant transferable skills for that learning outcome. Okay. So the transferable is going to be more spread out. It's going to be lower amounts in there. The subject specific one is going to be more large, chunkier bits, basically.
You're quantifying the skills focus.
Yes, and it's a proxy. It's a proxy measure. Okay. In reality, is that entirely valid to use that for the amount of hours? Is it exact that you're going to spend 23.6 hours on technical writing? No. But what it does is it starts a conversation, and it starts a way of getting more accurate measures as you progress through. And we'll come on to this maybe in a bit, but the learning outcomes become critical to this process. And what's quite clear from doing the report is that part of the reason, I knew this before we started really, but part of the reason for the capability competency chasm is that using learning outcomes within courses, within universities, is done as an internal language for the most part. It's done by the organization to explain either to their own organization or to students, and there's different stakeholders here, right? But it's usually one of those two. What are the capabilities that are being developed on this course or within this module? What are you going to learn, or what has been learned by the learners?
So once you've got this profile, skills profile of each program, how do you, clearly that can form a basis of a micro credential in itself. You've got the data there that could build that, but how do you connect that then to to the world of work? I know you use Lightcast data to do that. So what was, I suppose, 2 questions really. Why do that? Which I think I expect we'll go back to where we started, but also what could we learn from that?
Okay, so why do it? Why do the mapping approach? Yeah, so why skills profiling?
So why then take what you have as a learning item, because you've translated it into you take learning outcomes, you translate them into skills profiles. From that you could have a micro credential. But your paper goes further than that. You take that and then you compare it to the labour market. So I'm just trying to understand why that next step.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. Okay, so it comes back to why we do micro credentialing, right? So we start with this earlier in the discussion, is the drive to micro credentials isn't just an academic exercise. It isn't just because people think, oh yeah, we want to make our courses more interesting or more flexible in itself. It's because there's a need that's driving that change, and the need that's driving that change is a need for more flexible learning and better ways for a learner to engage in education and employment throughout their learner life journey. Okay, and ultimately, if you're asking why I'm interested in this from a personalized learning perspective. I'm interested in this because I believe that the solution to the skills gaps, the solution to a lot of the problems in society, actually, just on a large scale thing, is to change our educational model to enable people to learn in a way that best suits them, what is best needed by them, to enable them to optimize their lifelong learning earning performance. Because if you enable people to achieve their best and to perform at the best and to fit in best with society, you have a happier society, you have a more productive society, you have a better functioning society. Everybody benefits. And if you're going to do that, you've got to provide choice, much more choice and flexibility in what people are being asked to do in the educational system. You need to start to remove the time constrained nature of educational achievement. So you can still do the standard structures of going through schooling and university by all means, but you shouldn't have to have finished the qualification by the time it's utterly ridiculous that you, let's say between the ages of 11 and 18, have to make life-defining choices about your career, which effectively is what you do in the current system. Right? There's no reason for that at all, and it's inefficient in what happens later in society, right? So if you want to do that properly, you need to join up the entire thing. You need to bridge that capability competency chasm, right? So you need to say, okay, well, what is it that people are going to go into when they've finished with their studies, or even when they've not finished with their studies, what they're going to go into and then come back from to retrain, to reskill, right?
In this study, when you made that, when you basically put that to the test, and you took, was it the Huddersfield case study? It was your bachelor's in, was it software engineering?
Yeah.
And you took that, you profiled it as skills, and then you compared that to that potential outcome in the labour market. Did you take that kind of, because you use Lightcast data, did you take the same skills profiling methodology? So you took the Lightcast skills and then translated them into the same skills categories that we can see.
Well, let's skip forward to some of them so people can see a skills profile, and I'll explain as we're doing that. So I'll go through some of the bits first. So this is just doing the subject specific and the transferable skills, so you can see the distribution now. Okay, on to the next slide, please. And then here's it being compared to Lightcast data. Okay, so how do we do this? Well, what we already had the skills profiling data for the qualification. For the Lightcast data, what we did is we'd come up with, for our various degrees within computing engineering at the university, we'd come up with course level queries for Lightcast. Okay, so what that was is we'd looked at what are the different search components we want to put into a Lightcast query to get the right information about what graduate roles might be available to our graduates, right? And that included human input into the system. So it was okay, let's put these queries together, let's see what the results are, let's sense check those results against what our colleagues know within the school and what we know about employment afterwards. So for example, you might do a games design or a computer science degree, but you might end up in a role in user experience, for example, right? Now that might not come out if you just search for computer science or games design, but knowing where our graduates go, we can then build that in. Okay.
Right, a comprehensive and detailed mapping, course by course, informed by the academics as well as just the general data connections.
Exactly. So it's it's data led, but it's not data defined, right? It's not just trawling for key terms and getting a thing. It's bringing it together and sense checking it. Okay.
Yeah.
So we did that, and then from there we could draw out all the job postings that met that query, and from those we could code those against 21st century skills. Okay, so just like we did with the learning outcomes, we would code them against 21st century skills. Okay, both subject specific and transferable. Okay, now once we've got that, we've got an indicator of we've got a one-to-one match effectively, or a one-to-many match for the transferable between the 21st century skills and each individual skill in a job posting, right? Okay, so we know which skills link across. Right? At that point, what we did, but we could do it different ways, is we used the frequency within the job postings as a proxy for the level of importance within the market. Okay, but you could do other things. I mean,
concentration, for example.
Yeah. So there's different ways you could apply at that point, but basically and again, this is where further tests and explorations are relevant. Once you've got that, you can then convert it into a percentage. So basically you do a percentage skills profile. So these comparisons here are percentage skills profiles for a degree versus the percentage skills profiles in the labour market information, and you can see from that top graph there, the Lightcast information in yellow there, somewhat unsurprisingly, in the job postings for computer science or software engineering in this case, they're all about programming. They're all about particular programming languages or techniques that you can adopt, right? That's what they care about, and there is nothing in there about being able to communicate technically. There's nothing in there about self-reflection or innovation. Talk about a lack of innovation in society, and yet never mention it there. Now, some of it is because things are implicit. Some of it is because what the graduates want, what the employers want of the graduates is different from what the educationalists want. The educationalists do want those rounded people, and some of those skills that they're developing will be used in later job roles, not necessarily in the job role straight after graduation. So again, there's nuanced points here, but the point is, once you've got this, you can start them discussions. You can start them discussions with employers. You can start them discussions with accreditation bodies, with fellow academics, with institutions about what you are providing and how you're providing it.
And then this is looking in more depth at the transferable skills.
Yeah. So I mean, just briefly on this, you could again, there's a large spread on transferable skills, so you're only going to get a broad distribution. But I guess what's quite interesting here is that there's quite a few areas where they're big in terms of job roles, but not necessarily within the course, right? So the one I was mentioning about leadership management, you can probably see that combined, it's probably a combined between those two is probably reasonably well fitted between the course and the labour market requirements, but separately it looks distinctive. It's quite interesting that problem solving is more on the academic course than in the job roles. It's really interesting. But then there's other areas, for example, the ones down the bottom here, communication, sustainability, social learning, where clearly there's a real demand within society, but it's not necessarily expressed in the course, right? And again, this can be used not just in looking at and refining and refreshing and considering choices within the course, but it can also be used to help inform graduating students on what sort of things to emphasize in their job applications, what sort of things from their course they can actually communicate about and reflect on. So again, it's a useful way of looking at what you're learning and then going to be doing in earning, and seeing how to best align those.
And when you looked at these results, were you thinking there's things we need to change about the programs, or did you feel it, across the case studies, not necessarily just this one, but did you feel there was a particular takeaway when you were comparing the labor market insight with the kind of skills profile insight of the courses? Was there a consistent thread there, do you think?
Yeah, I think there's a few key learnings. I know we've got only a few minutes left now, so I guess I'll go on to where we are, what we've learned, and what we do next, right? So the in terms of what we've learned, the learning outcomes within universities, the way that different institutions approached that was varied. In some cases, because of constraints that were placed upon their quality assurance systems, they restricted the number of learning outcomes in any given module. And what would end up happening is you get skills being blended into a single learning outcome. So I think there's a real challenge there in terms of the clarity of the messaging. The learning outcomes were often written for different audiences, so either for students or for the organization itself, but usually not for employers, right? So there's a piece there. There's a piece in terms of implicit learning within a course versus what's defined in the learning outcomes. Okay, so there's a piece there. What you've got down on paper isn't necessarily telling with what you think you're producing, or in fact what you are producing. And then the things for what's next, I think there's quite a broad range there. I mean, from a personalized learning perspective, there's an example of how you could develop personalized learning within a degree. So that's in the Huddersfield case study example at the end. You could replace your traditional model. So you could actually go with a stackable credit model and have personalized learning within a university degree. That is possible through this sort of approach. We want to try and explore this overseas. So I'm going to be doing this in 2 US universities in the new year. There's no reason why it shouldn't work there, but it'll be interesting to see how that application works with US labour market information and US courses. Once we've done that, we'll obviously look elsewhere. And if anybody wants to get in touch about doing it anywhere else in the world, that would be really interesting. And then I think from there, there's the opportunity to look at if we can move to a situation where learning outcomes can be expressed more in terms of skills, either tagged to it or using keywords in the learning outcomes themselves. That opens up huge opportunities, because I mean, for example, one of the things we're doing with Lightcast at Huddersfield, in fact, is trying to produce a detailed student dashboard of, okay, you've studied this course, what next? What next for you? What can you do? Where can you go? How is this going to work for you going forward? And and these things about giving people clarity on the pathway through life. We can start doing that in higher education. We can then feed it back down into a pre-18 education, and suddenly we can actually realize what I'm hoping we will be able to do, which is a personalized learner and a journey through life, where you know what your learning is helping contribute towards, and what the choices are available to you. As it is at the moment, you've got people that at the age of 13 or 14, it's luck as to whether they have careers in school, whether they have a parent that guides them effectively on what to study, that they have a happen chance meeting with somebody and decide to do something, right? That's how people's careers are defined a lot of the times nowadays, right? It shouldn't be like that. You should be able to go through the education system and be aware of what opportunity is available to you.
Yeah, no, and thank you for taking us through that. I mean, for me, what is particularly interesting is how you've got micro credentialing is enabled through this kind of work, because it gives you the items that form part of the credentials. You've got the data, the metadata that goes into those credentials, sit behind them and make them work as a a piece of technology that are machine readable that can fit into future ecosystems of hiring and applying for jobs with machine readable qualifications, all of that kind of thing, it future proofs the learners who receive these, but also it helps us understand, right, what is the alignment between what we're developing in the sector for students in terms of their attributes, their qualities, their knowledge, their competencies, their capabilities, and how well that aligns with what employers are looking for. We can't always, we can't see what employers are looking for 10 years hence, because we're not 10 years hence. But we can look at now. And the thing is, with the data updates every day. And so there is, if you have data systems by which you can make that connection between what you are teaching, what you're delivering, and what is happening in the wider world, if you have those agile systems, you're then able to keep things as up to date as they can be. So the step between where a student is at when they complete a program or a credential or whatever it is, whatever item of learning it is, and the step to applying that in the real world is as small as it can be. But that does require agility, and I think what you've done with the learning outcomes is interesting, because who wants to rewrite learning outcomes every single time that you know, there's a slight change in, I don't know, what software is being used in a particular sector. Of course, no one wants to go through all those committee meetings and course review meetings, etc. So finding different ways to include those and have a system for managing that change within it that deals with credentialing side, the learning side, as well as where the outcomes are, I think is fascinating. I really recommend people have a look at the report. There's a number of different examples from different universities looking at what happens when you start to do this. And I think there's a lot more work that could be done, but certainly if people are interested, should certainly follow up with Rupert. Rupert also works with the International Council on Badges and Credentialing, and they have a lot of resources which can be quite useful for people who are getting started with micro-credentialing. So if you're interested in exploring further, do reach out to myself or to Rupert, or both of us, because we'd be really interested to see if there's a way we can support you on your journey, either from Rupert's side, the micro-credentialing side, or my side from the labour market data side. But we'll have to wrap it up there. We're up just past time, but thank you very, very much again, Rupert. It's absolutely fascinating, the work that you're doing and leading on, not just in this country, but worldwide. So it'd be really interesting to see what happens in the States with this model. And thank you as well, everyone, for joining us. And I certainly look forward to connecting with you. And if you do have questions, I haven't had any come through, but if you do have questions, do send them across, and we'll certainly come back to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.